Welcome to Don Treader's Stories. Let me present to you. The ghost of General Eduardo de Zúñiga goes for a walk. The ghost of General Eduardo de Zúñiga walked through the winding streets of Intramuros, the old walled city of Manila, his boots making no sound on the cracked cobblestones. His ethereal form, tall and dignified in the faint moonlight, drifted like a whisper among the ancient buildings, his translucent uniform bearing the proud insignia of the Spanish Empire. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, mixing with the warmth of the tropical night. He remembered. His first memory was the stifling heat that greeted him when his ship had arrived in Manila centuries ago. The sun, harsh and unforgiving, had beaten down upon his brow, and the air was thick with humidity, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. The bewilderment had been immediate. The vast expanse of lush, verdant jungle that surrounded the city walls, the unfamiliar chirping of insects, and the wide smiles of the locals, so different from the stiff courtesies of Spain, had made him feel like a man lost at sea. He had been a young officer then, proud and determined to serve his king in this far-flung colony, certain that he could bring order to this place. As he moved deeper into the maze of alleys, his memories shifted to a different time. He recalled Intramuros as it had been, a jewel of Spanish power in the Philippines, the enclave of the elite. The grand stone houses, the sprawling plazas, the clergy and the noble families who strolled the streets in fine silks and lace. There was a time when the sound of horses' hooves echoed off the stone walls, and carriages carrying the city's most important figures glided past the grand gates of the Fort Santiago. Now, Intramuros lay in squalor, the once proud walls chipped and crumbling, the streets cluttered with refuse, and the stone houses darkened by time and neglect. The grandeur had rotted away, leaving only traces of a forgotten empire. Yet it was not just the city that haunted him. It was its people. The Filipinos, the Indios as they were called by his fellow countrymen, had been a paradox to him. There had been something so beautiful, almost ethereal, about them, their dark eyes full of fire, their skin glowing under the tropical sun, but they were flawed, or so he had believed. They lacked, he thought, the discipline, the order of Spain. Their passions were too wild, their desires too uncontained. Yet now, as a ghost, he saw the arrogance in those old thoughts. The Filipinos had been nothing if not resilient, something that became painfully clear during the revolution. He stopped before a crumbling archway, the memory of a single man rising from the depths of his soul. José Rizal. The writer, the visionary, the one whose incendiary words had ignited the revolution that would ultimately shake the foundations of Spanish rule. Eduardo remembered the day he had signed the order for Rizal's execution. A necessary act, they had said. A traitor, a dangerous man whose ideas threatened the empire. He had believed it then. But as he watched the firing squad line up, saw Rizal fall to the ground, his body crumpling into the dirt, something deep inside him had stirred, doubt. And it was that doubt that followed him even in death. For Rizal's death had not quelled the fires of rebellion. It had only fanned them. He saw it all now, the years of bloodshed, the endless clashes between the Spanish forces and the revolutionary Catipuneros. He remembered the Civil War, the horror of it, the realization that Spain's grip on the Philippines was slipping. And then, on one fateful day, he had met his end, cut down by a Catipunero's blade, a symbol of everything the revolution sought to overthrow. Death had not brought him peace. Instead, it tethered him to this place, to Intramuros, where he had witnessed the endless march of history. He recalled the strange charade that had unfolded in Manila Bay, the Americans pretending to battle the Spanish forces, but in truth, they had already struck a deal. Spain had sold the Philippines to them, a backroom transaction that ended centuries of Spanish rule. And yet, the Filipinos, the ones who had fought so fiercely for their freedom, had been excluded from the deal. Another empire had arrived, wearing a different flag but with the same hunger for control. The general passed through the shadow of Fort Santiago, where the old fortress had once stood proud under the Spanish flag. Now, it carried the echoes of World War II, when the Japanese used it as a garrison. He remembered the days of the occupation, the years when the Japanese turned Intramuros into a prison of suffering and death. Countless Filipinos had been tortured and executed within these very walls. The fort was no longer a symbol of imperial power, it had become a place of unspeakable cruelty. Eduardo could still hear the cries of the prisoners, their voices rising from the stone cells, blending with the wind. He drifted through the streets following the ghosts of time. The 1970s came to him, the days of protest when students filled the streets, rallying against the Marcos regime. Young faces full of hope and defiance clashed with the military, their demands for change met with brutal force. He had seen the violence, the soldiers beating the protesters, the streets stained with blood. Yet in those young faces, Eduardo saw a reflection of the revolutionaries he had once fought against. The struggle was different, but the yearning was the same. He passed by the steps of Manila Cathedral, where a beggar lay curled up, his frail body shivering in the cool night air. Eduardo bent down, a reflex born of the man he once had been, the one who would have ordered his soldiers to offer help. But his hand passed through the beggar's shoulder like mist. He was powerless, a mere observer, unable to intervene in the lives of the living. And that was his curse. For all that he had seen, for all that he had been a part of, he was nothing more than a witness. He had watched the Philippines pass from one empire to another, seen its people fight for their freedom, endure suffering, and continue to rise. But he could do nothing. He could not change what had been or what was still happening. His time had passed and the world had moved on without him. As dawn broke, the general faded into the walls of Intramuros, the last echoes of his memories dissolving into the stone.